So without further ado, can we introduce to the meeting Jackie Walker, who needs no
Hi.
introduction, of course.
That never sounds very good, does it? She doesn't need any introduction. And that kind of leads on to what I really want to be speaking about, which is kind of focusing on freedom of speech, but it's also looking at how we have got here and how we need to start analysing what we need to do about it. And of course, Roger, as usual, was right. This statement that is always being chorus, that they want to make Labour into a safe space, is true. They do. They want to make it a safe space for racists and warmongers. I mean, that's plain. And anyone who objects to that, anybody who wants to actually further the cause of equality, makes people like that feel uncomfortable. And that's what we have very clearly here. And we can see that in the way, even, for example, Starmer is talking about corporation tax, because his aim is to make the powerful and the establishment feel comfortable in Labour. And there is nothing that makes people who hold power feel more uncomfortable than to have that power challenged. And it's our role, it's our job to not be silenced. And it's our job, whatever is happening, to speak the truth. And using that kind of hackneyed phrase, to speak truth to power. Because we're not just speaking truth to power for now, for what is happening now in the immediate present. We are also laying down marker stones for future battles, which I am absolutely sure will come. So I love that bit about Alice in Wonderland, by the way, because obviously off with her head is exactly what they wanted to do with me. But as you can see, my head is still very much on my neck. So what I see at the moment is that what's happening at the moment is not actually just about the Labour Party, and our vision should not just be about the Labour Party, because this attack on the left, on the forces of radical change, which of course do include people who might never be or have been in the Labour Party, is much wider than coming from the Labour Party apparatchiks, the Labour Party bureaucracy. It's actually coming from the media, it's coming from the commentariat, it's coming from people who are our employers. And that sort of is what makes it so extremely powerful, that this is the biggest attack on the forces of radicalism that we have ever seen. But that also tells you something, because it tells you how extremely powerful we are and how scared that they are. And yes, we're at where we're at now, but just think how easy it is to just turn that. How easy, actually, in many ways, it was for Black Lives Matter to go onto the streets and start challenging them directly. And that's what we have to do. We have to always be there in waiting to take the opportunities. Now, I'm just going to look at how they've kind of managed this trick, and it's kind of linked, because the anti-Semitism witch hunt is also linked to the way that they are now co-opting, supposedly, freedom of speech as their own. If you remember, what the right have done is actually taken our vocabulary of liberation, of equality, of anti-racism, and made it their own and used it against them. And in part, they did that by emptying out the language of power and the politics of dispossession and turning it into a sort of bottomed out identity politics where evidence is not relevant, where history doesn't really matter. It's all about how the individual feels. And they're doing exactly the same technique now with freedom of speech. It all comes down to how people feel. But of course, it's not how everybody feels. I mean, people don't seem to care very much, for example, about how anti-Zionist Jews feel, or about how people who are really working for racial equality and for human rights feel. It's only a certain section of people whose feelings actually seem to matter. And why this is so important is that freedom of speech is at the very core of our democracy, what democracy there is. Freedom of speech, if we do not have it, we have nothing. Now, this is how they've done it. First of all, they identify an idea or a concept, which really it's hard for anybody to contradict. In this case, it'll be that free speech is important and that we all need to protect free speech. Now, everybody would agree with that. We need to protect free speech. Of course, we can have conversations about the limitations of free speech, but generally people would agree with that. And they will point at Russia, and they will point at China, and they will point at Northern Korea, at Korea in terms of making an example about what we don't want to be. Then they establish a cause and gather a campaign around it. And in this case, I'll give you one of the, for examples, the way that they have done this is to look at the case of what's the awfulness of what's happening with the Uyghurs. And everybody, yet again, mostly will, there will be some people who dispute that or dispute the accuracy of the reporting, but nobody wants people to have their freedom encroached upon. And everybody will be agreeing with that. And they amass their support by doing it. And this is, of course, what they did with anti-Semitism when they said, everybody is against racism, and anti-Semitism has been the longest living racism in the world, and we want to stamp it out. Nobody, of course, is actually going to disagree with that. When you've done that, you then communicate via the media and the other sort of establishment tools. Sometimes they're organizations, sometimes there'll be newspapers. You'll establish that there are certain breaches of freedom of speech going on, and it will then become accepted that this is happening, and you don't actually need to show evidence. So, for example, if you look at what's happening with the discussion in universities, it's very clear that the evidence shows that very, very, very few meetings are actually closed. But what they tell us is that the left are out there rampaging in universities, shutting down meetings. And that becomes a given. And if you challenge that given, you will suddenly find yourself not being invited to comment on Newsnight. You will find yourself maybe not publishing that article in The Guardian. When it gets really bad, you'll find yourself not getting work. And how this acts is actually withdrawing from the general population any alternative view of what is going on. So people who are not, kind of political nerds like we are, they will just simply accept the case that is given to them, whatever that case will be, which in terms of what I'm talking about would be, for example, that the left are on the rampage at universities and they're shutting down all our meetings. Now, the problem is, for these forces of reaction, is that the last thing that they want is actual freedom of speech, apart from for themselves. So again, they go to a typical McCarthyite strategy, and they will find an odd example of it here and there, and you will see it repeated and repeated and repeated, and there will be horror about it. And young girls innocent young girls will be seen on social media weeping because they're scared to come out of their student bedrooms because they're so scared that their political views might be actually countered. And this will actually be going on. So if you started thinking there wasn't a problem, you will end up thinking, well, there must be some kind of problem. And of course, what you may not actually realize is that those same students you have seen are avid supporters of actually, for example, a movement that is trying to shut down free speech, apart from the free speech that they actually support. So the next part, the next ingredient they need is a cause célèbre. And in this case, we have it with David Miller. Now, nobody really very much, apart from a very few people, and some of them have been in the meeting today, actually know what David Miller has actually said. But the issue is, if you don't agree that what David Miller says makes Jews, who then get all counted as one set of people, terrified to come out of their little student bedrooms, you are then smeared with being a racist yourself. So everybody is scared of countering it. And in that way, they take from us the strategies and the vocabulary that is naturally ours, which is to support and enable the free exchange of ideas and equality for all, and the condemnation of oppressive practices, whether that's happening in Israel or in the United States or in the UK. So at that point, we are silenced. At that point, where do we go? Well, I would say that is why an organization like this is so critically important. Because as ever, the notion of exile also maintains the determination to return. And as somebody of both African and Jewish heritage, the notion of being in exile and the idea of constantly struggling for a return is something that is very familiar with me. And I think it's something that we should put at the front of our practice. Now, just like any prophet, they'll hate me for calling myself a prophet. I can't stand on any mountain and see what's over it. I can't tell you when the next opportunity or the greatest opportunity is going to come for us to actually go back and take possession of the role which is ours as socialists. But what I do know is that we have to be ready for when it comes. And I do know that one thing we can't risk, because it's worse than death, is to be silenced. So, socialists, power to us and power to the people. Thank you.